Good afternoon. My name is Jamie Gass. I'm Director of Pioneer Education. Welcome to our webinar, MCAS at a Crossroads, the debate over standardized testing. Really pleased to have with us James Conway and a history teacher at Revere High School, and Meredith Coolidge, who is campaigns manager for Democrats for Education Reform. So just to kind of set the table a little bit, MCAS is a key part of the landmark 1993 Education Reform Act, the grand bargain of essentially a great deal of additional state money in exchange for accountability and standards and testing for everybody in the system. It's a bipartisan compromise that really, in truth, is probably the most successful thing that any state has done in the last 50 years. Bill Weld was the governor. Tom Birmingham and Mark Roosevelt were the co-chairs of the Education Committee, and they really wanted to ensure that all school children across the Commonwealth had access to a high-quality, academic content-rich, liberal arts and STEM education, the kind that they themselves had benefited from when they went to high-quality private schools or Catholic schools, or later on to the Ivy League. And I'll just use the example of Tom Birmingham. Tom grew up in Chelsea, from a pretty modest background, had an opportunity to go to some really good quality Catholic schools and private schools, and later went to Harvard and became a Rhodes Scholar. He studied Shakespeare at Oxford, and he really wanted to make sure that the kids of the kind that he grew up around in Chelsea and in Fall River and New Bedford, and that they would get the same academic opportunities and access to the same standards and quality that kids in the leafy suburbs had gotten. And so, we're at this point, we're spending about $11 billion at the state and local level. This is a mechanism that helps deliver the equity and fairness for approximately 1 million school children in the Commonwealth, and MCAS is a key part of that. It's been part of ed reform. It's been a big success. The MCAS has been aligned with, generally speaking, very high quality standards for students, with our state curriculum frameworks, with teacher testing. And I think the architects of the ed reform were actually very wise. They didn't initially have every grade tested. They alternated subject by year, so it'd be third grade reading, fourth grade math, et cetera. And this has contributed to enormous results. I mean, going back to 2005, we're been essentially number one in the country on NAEP, the nation's report card, in both reading and math, as well as in science. We're the only state that can claim to be internationally competitive in math and science on both TIMSS and PISA. These are the sort of the gold standard of international testing. So it's served the Commonwealth and its students and its public education system just extraordinarily well. And, the thing that I think is important for people to remember or realize that the annual testing that we have in grades 3 through 8, and then in high school, that is mandated by the federal government, the No Child Left Behind, that was sort of, reiterated in the Obama administration under ESSA. I mean, we've had pretty broad support among Republicans and Democrats going back many, many years for testing and some basic testing to ensure fairness and equality of educational opportunity. But it's federal law does not require us to have, it does require us to have a test, but it does not need to be high stakes. This is a state decision. This is a state and local decision. As much of education reform has been, I remember, I've been doing this long enough that I remember I worked in Chelsea before 1993. So I remember what the landscape looked like when there was no MCAS, when there was no basic test. And it was really, it was a little bit like being a pilot that was a barnstorming pilot that had no instrumentation. Really, superintendents and policymakers, they knew there were achievement gaps. There was no way to identify them or remediate them. And it really, the data alone has opened up the whole policymaking landscape so that teachers and school officials and policymakers and taxpayers alike and parents know how their students are doing, and they know where to make corrections and improvements. So the thing it's also, I think, important to remember is that the opponents to MCAS also are generally opposed to a lot of the other elements of ed reform, the standards, the teacher testing, the basic district accountability. And they're kind of in a way at odds with the whole idea of ed reform itself, which was the money for the accountability. Again, it's a basic element of our democratic society is that everyone, all students, have access to learning about the founding documents and Frederick Douglass and great literature and poetry, as well as the STEM and mathematics content that will allow them to compete in the global society. And this year is the 70th anniversary of the Brown v. Board of Education landmark decision. And we did an event, back in the spring with Cheryl Brown Henderson, and I was really struck by a comment that she said is that there's no us and them, there's only us, and this is a country that needs to belong to everyone. So anyway, with that, I'm really going to I'm very happy to invite Meredith and James on, and so we can have a longer, more robust conversation about this. Well, hey, folks, thanks again for joining us. Really, really appreciate it. I'm going to start off a question that I think I'd like to have both of you answer, and just tell us briefly about some of your background and your professional experiences and the lens through which you view your support for MCAS as a graduation requirement.
Sure. I can kick us off here. So thanks for having us. And Jamie, thanks for the helpful framing. I'm Meredith Coolidge. As Jamie mentioned, I'm the campaigns manager for Democrats for Education Reform, Massachusetts. And in answering this question, I'll sort of start out with my own personal why education, and then I can talk a little bit more about our organization. So, I'll go all the way back to college. I interned at the U.S. Department of Education in Washington, D.C. in the Office of Congressional and Legislative Affairs. And in that experience, really realized that in order to make impact in this space, I needed that on the ground experience. And so I joined Teach for America, where I was sent to San Antonio, Texas. I taught 7th through 9th grade English language arts in a Title I school for 2 years. And the second year of my teaching experience, which, as anybody who's ever taught can know, the first year you're getting your feet on the ground, the second year you're really starting to make some impact, was the first full year of the pandemic. And so I really saw a lot of inequity in that time period. And at the time in Texas, similar to Massachusetts, 9th and 10th graders had the same sort of English language requirement of taking an assessment as we do here as the graduation requirement. And that year that I was, teaching during the pandemic, they took that away and then they brought it back. And so I can understand the feeling of what it looks like when students don't have that standard that they're being held to, and what that does look like, and then what it looks like when it comes back. And a lot of my students, didn't take it as seriously. A lot of students who were really, really capable, were really, really committed. But if they're not being held to that standard, and it doesn't really matter to them, and they know they're going to pass anyway, it's not, as personally as big of a deal. And so that really ignited in me an understanding of why accountability matters and why making sure that we're holding that standard for kids. And so now I'm working in the education policy and advocacy space on behalf of Democrats for Education Reform. And so I'm currently managing our local and statewide political efforts for our work here, but Democrats for Education Reform and our affiliated Education Reform Now, we elect Democratic leaders here in the Commonwealth who are committed to our vision of a public education system that empowers all students, especially our most marginalized students. And accountability really is a key issue for us, and obviously for me personally, but DFER has long championed policies to ensure that all students are receiving the education that they deserve. And we're, leading the efforts on the, campaign to protect the graduation requirement right now, which is on the ballot. And so I'm helping out with a lot of our coalition work, and really excited. James is one of our awesome teachers who is lending his voice to it. So I can turn it over to James to do a little intro of himself.
Thank you, Meredith, and it's great to be here with everybody today. In terms of my own background, I came into education a little bit late. I came into it around 28, 29. After a career doing some political campaign work myself, as well as in the paralegal field. And I really came to it because I wanted to see kids get excited about civics and get excited about government, get excited about participating in our democracy. And that's really sort of my mission statement as a social studies teacher. I teach world history and psychology, but I do bring a lot of sort of current events and civics into both of those courses. And it's something that I need to do as well in my role as a speech and debate coach. We've gotten to, for an urban district, we punch well above our weight. Our team has been able to send some 2 students to a national championship during my time, and we have a couple state champions on the team as well. So those are really the 2 passions that I bring for the role. And it's my 7th year as a teacher in Revere. And I also taught my practicum for a year in Roxbury at a charter school. So I sort of have seen both public and charter, and I've also grew up in Cambridge and live in Haverhill. So I've kind of in urban districts my whole career and life. And so that's some of the perspective I bring as well. I also was one of the first students to take the MCAS, I think both in 8th grade and as a 10th grader when it was a requirement. I don't teach an MCAS subject, but I do teach skills that are used on MCAS, and I've used MCAS as a teacher. And then as a parent, I want to, I like this system and think we should keep it for the future as well. So that's something that I'm thinking about that I want to contribute to.
Great. So as I mentioned, the MCAS is a key component of the grand bargain of the Ed Reform Law in '93. Again, progressive funding formula in exchange for high stakes tests and rigorous academic standards. Could you each talk a little bit about MCAS and what it's meant as the keystone of the Commonwealth's historic achievements, particularly on NAEP, that the nation's report card carries a lot of weight in the achievement and what that's meant for the state and for the students.
Yeah, I can jump in. I can jump into that a little bit. At least from the student perspective, the ground level, what we call street data. I've seen it as very helpful just to figure out, as I'm getting incoming 10th graders, who's proficient with sort of the ELA skills that really align well with social studies standards as well, particularly reading and writing standards. So it allows me to see which students I'm getting that are capable of doing the work, which students that may need additional support. And I can kind of group those students together, especially in a heterogeneous class. We do have honors classes again, but most of our world history classes are common core classes. So we're able to integrate those different students with different abilities and get them grouped together. And it's just really helpful from a teacher perspective to be able to make those groupings, and I can see them as they progress, right? So that's kind of at the macro day-to-day level. And then in terms of how it affects my high school and my particular district, we want to show the state that we're actually making progress in closing these achievement gaps, particularly since we're a diverse district, and since we have, I think, 70% are it's a 70% Latino district, I think a 25 or 30% English language learner district. We have a lot of students who are on IEP, a lot of students who are on free and reduced lunch. So being able to show that we're able to punch above our weight, we're only in the middle of the pack for per pupil among Commonwealth cities. So being able to show that we're able to punch above our weight, help those students make progress. That's really something that actually in the past, our district has bragged about our MCAS scores. It's a selling point for keeping, middle class and affluent parents who live here in the public schools, as well as letting, I think Raj Chetty cited us as a miracle on the Mystic with a couple other of our peer districts. He's a Harvard economist who looks at this, that we have a very high degree of upward mobility. And part of that comes from being able to use this data to make adjustments to our education practices, to be able to inform how we teach, and to use this data to kind of close those gaps and make progress every year if we can on closing them.
Yeah, and to just piggyback off of that, it's always great to hear from the practitioner level, James. Thank you. And sort of like zooming out into the more policy, higher level side, my grandmother's retired now, but she taught for more than 50 years and taught in Massachusetts public schools prior to 1993, as, Jamie was describing his experience in Chelsea. So she often talks about how, as a parent and as a teacher, you sort of knew that certain school districts, I guess, whatever that means, were better than others, but there wasn't really a way of knowing and having that hard data of what was being taught in classrooms beyond classroom observations, nor really a standard measurement for student learning. So I think, and you'll probably hear me say this a lot today, but I think the MCAS really is a tool which provides us data, as James was just describing, for us to make, both at the policy level, the advocacy level, but also the parent and teacher level, to make those objective, informed decisions comparing districts and providing the allocation of resources to certain school districts or certain schools based on student outcomes. I think, it may be trite to say this, but we can all agree that students deserve a really high quality education, regardless of their zip code. And without that data, how would we be able to do that? One thing I will name on this, just as far as when we're talking about our NAEP scores and being number one, is if you haven't checked out, the Ed Trust a few years ago did a report on called Number One for Some. And so when you break down the demographic data, we do have a lot of gaps as far as racial, socioeconomic information. That's not necessarily meaning that Massachusetts is the number one for every single type of student. So we definitely do have a long way to go. I'm not saying that this absolutely cured all of our problems in public education, but the key really is that without the data, we wouldn't know that. And so we know, 50% of third graders are not reading on grade level. We wouldn't know that without the MCAS. And with the MCAS, we're able to pinpoint those issues in those places and be able to allocate the resources that are needed. Without the MCAS, we'd be flying blind. So.
Yeah, I want to build off of that a little bit too. I mean, that was always what Tom Birmingham's contention was, is that MCAS didn't create the achievement gaps, it revealed them. And, it was even Edie Hirsch, who's probably the best respected standards-based education reformer of the last 30, 40 years, observed even back in 2009 or so. He said, if you're a poor minority kid, you want to be in Massachusetts because of the standards, because of the tests, because the students and the teachers through the teacher test are all in a way taught, and they are all tested on the same kind of material. That has been part of the secret sauce, is the alignment of the standards and the test and the teacher test, so that everyone in the system is kind of on the same page in terms of what's being taught. So James, for you, the part of this ed reform was the establishing these state curriculum frameworks. They have been revered really by folks across the spectrum for decades. People have acknowledged that the standards in Massachusetts are, if not the highest, certainly among the highest, and that they have correlated with, as I said earlier, with national and international gains. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what's in the standards. What is the sort of substance of what's taught in a history class or an ELA class or what have you, that is tested on MCAS, just to give the audience and people a wider sense that MCAS is a test, but it's a test that tests standards and curriculum, that's a key part of what this conversation is actually really about.
Yeah, I can speak both for my subject and also a little bit for the ELA side. Math and STEM standards I might not not be as familiar with, but in terms of the ELA standards, we have we have to write an argumentative essay as part of the components, which is critical for history, right? There's an easy crossover there. Almost all of the summatives that we have in terms of common assessments that we use at the end of every quarter to assess our own students at the department level are argumentative essays for the most part, or at least argumentative presentations, or some kind of medium that's being used to present a case. And you have to cite evidence, you have to cite sources, draw from texts. So textual analysis is another important one, as is gathering sources, gathering evidence, being able to interpret evidence, and being able to read for point of view. And what's nice about the ELA standards is so many of them cross-apply to social studies. So in some ways, even though we don't have our own test yet, and there's a strong, I personally feel we ought to have one, particularly for civics, but obviously it's a little bit fraught in this climate to pick which history to test. But I do think that having the ELA standards at least gives us a bit of a foundation that we can work with and cross-apply over to social studies. And then in terms of social studies standards, we've had a lot of public input. Teachers, students, and families have been at the table to make these standards, and they've become far more inclusive and equitable, I would say, over the last few years. At least in world history, when I first started teaching it, it still had more of a Eurocentric lens. And now that we've had all this community input and revisions, we're really looking more at a global lens and bringing in the Haitian Revolution is a very important event that we study, a very critical anti-slavery revolution early on, prior to the Civil War. We also look at imperialism in Africa. We look at a lot of human rights issues. I just went to a great PD last summer that's bringing in, because of the other state requirement to teach the Holocaust and genocides, we're now creating a whole unit based around that and looking at current events and 20th century events through that lens. So I think those are all ways that they're kind of like seeds that have blossomed, I guess, in some ways from the ed reform. So obviously you might not feel directly connected to the MCAS test in some ways, but I think it's created a very easy way of us saying we're going to have certain standards that we're going to assess. And it made the legislature very comfortable to say we're going to require that Massachusetts high schools teach genocide and human rights. And even though that's not something that's going to be assessed on the MCAS, it is something we're required to teach. And we're all on board with that. And we wouldn't have this great PD I went to, and we wouldn't have this new curriculum without that mandate and that standard being put in place. And I think these other standards also cross-inform the social studies curriculum and make it more enriching for students. And we're trying to line it up as well to make them not just college ready, but career ready. I think it's great that, Governor Healy and Governor Shapiro and now Vice President Harris are saying college may not be the path for everybody. We want to make sure people have alternative pathways to get a good job, but you're still going to need those critical reading and writing skills, at least at the high school level, that are assessed on MCAS. So you should at least be able to read a newspaper and understand what's going on. So I do think that having these baseline standards ensures that every student, regardless of their zip code, regardless of whether or not they are on the college track or on the career track, have these skills and can be employable as soon as they graduate from a Massachusetts high school with a Massachusetts diploma.
Yeah, I want to echo that. We at Pioneer have been big proponents of U.S. history and civics, sort of keystone. It's really what public education is supposed to be about. It's sort of the wellspring of democratic self-government and learning in that. But I want to echo what you said. I mean, look, the Commonwealth is a state that's been home to just an enormous number of literary figures. I mean, it could be Hawthorne or Melville or Edith Wharton or Emily Dickinson, Emerson, Thoreau. And it's that really rich academic quality that you find in the poetry and the literature and the drama, which has contributed to these historic gains that the Commonwealth and its students have made on things like NAEP, because the reality of it is that the characters and the plot and all the stories that really bind us together as a democratic society, a lot of them originate from Massachusetts. It's a big part of the character of the state. You really can't walk more than a couple of blocks without bumping into the house of some famous writer or poet. And it's a really unique feature of the state, as it is the history of the state. I mean, you mentioned the anti-slavery movement. Well, Frederick Douglass, when he fled slavery, he came to Massachusetts. He came to New Bedford and the areas of New Bedford and Nantucket. I mean, this is the bedrock of understanding American history, really. And so these are the kinds of topics that people really need to better understand to be citizens. But they, the citizens also and people on all sides of the debate have to understand that there's a lot at stake in terms of academic quality and the basic assurance that every kid has access to it, not just kids in the leafy suburbs. So, Meredith, maybe you could talk a little bit about, from my point of view, one of the major virtues of MCAS also is that it's provided a lot of basic data. I mean, it's hard to make decisions and public policy decisions more broadly, whether it's in a classroom or a school district or statewide for 1 million kids, or address, race and class-based achievement gaps if you don't know and have any data. So maybe you could talk about the importance of data that comes out of MCAS and what that means for policymakers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad that the MCAS sort of in this conversation and in general is being framed as this diagnostic tool, right? I think that's the way that we should look at the MCAS. It's as a tool. I have a mentor who describes this tool as, when you have a child who says, "I'm sick," you take their temperature, and that helps you decide whether the child needs to go to the hospital or take some Tylenol, or maybe they're fibbing a little bit. And I think if you see the MCAS as sort of that diagnostic tool of figuring out, okay, this is a snapshot of where this child is, and this is the remediation that it needs to happen for the next steps is really important. And frankly, if we see the MCAS not as an onus on the student, but as a tool that we adults can use to make sure our kids are getting what they need. I think that's really where it's meant to be. And obviously there are ways to improve it. You know, the Voices for Academic Equity Coalition, which Education Reform now leads, did a really interesting, you know, report last year on the MCAS and ways to improve it and, you know, make sure that data is getting into the right hands of the right people in a more timely fashion, giving professional development to teachers and parents to make sure that they're using the data properly in the right ways that it's supposed to be used. But as opposed to just throwing it out, it's important to make sure that we're fixing the system that currently exists. The other piece, and I'd be interested to hear James's perspective on this, but it also removes subjectivity in many ways. You know, as an educator, if my kids are doing, and I say my kids, I mean my students, are doing really well in their MCAS year after year, and I have some new administrator who comes in and is unfair to me on my performance review without any real documentation, you know, my students' MCAS scores demonstrate my competence as a teacher, full stop. And it's a way that teachers can use that evidence and that data to say, I am an effective educator. And, you know, vice versa, if someone after years in the classroom is not demonstrating effectiveness with their students' MCAS growth data, then no matter how fun they are in the classroom, we need to make sure that educator is getting the resources and the support that they need to be able to do their job effectively and make sure our kids are getting the education they deserve. So I think if we stop thinking about the MCAS as something to potentially punish students and start recognizing grown-ups' role in MCAS results and the ways that we can use it, it's really important.
Yeah, so, you know, we talked a little bit about the importance of social mobility around education, the importance of equality of opportunity, making sure kids have access to, you know, rich sort of liberal arts curriculum. But I have a question for both of you. So I'm old enough that I remember A Nation at Risk in 1983. In fact, I was in high school when it was launched. It basically talked about how the American public education was in real jeopardy, primarily because it wasn't going to be able to compete globally and in the global economy. And of course, Massachusetts has done that really with MCAS and with the standards that we put in place that gave kids access to Algebra 1 in 8th grade, the way they do in a lot of higher performing East Asian countries. You know, we've not only have these comparisons that we have domestically, well, on things like NAEP, but we have TIMSS and PISA, and Massachusetts has tested its own individual country. And again, it's the only state in the union that can claim to be internationally competitive in math and science. I mean, this is an enormous historic accomplishment that back in the 80s and early 90s when ed reform was being launched, that was just aspirational. No one thought that it was going to actually happen or believed it could happen, but Massachusetts did it. Can you talk a little bit about that, about the importance of competing internationally and giving kids the knowledge and skills certainly in reading and the humanities, but also in math and science, and the importance that has for kids and their ability to succeed and compete in the world?
Sure. And the way that I'll take this question is really that international data, and I know that Pioneer just recently did a report on this, really helps to affirm the reliability of our assessment. And so I know there was some research done between, I think it was 2001 and maybe 2015. Massachusetts student scores on the international assessments did match that of student scores on, you know, the MCAS and in these top performing countries. And so these results in combination with the NAEP scores do show that the MCAS is a reliable assessment. And so I think if you look at it that way too, of that the education assessments and tools that we are using are, you know, putting our students into these competitive places with students globally, especially as we move into this sort of global economy. That's another important point as well.
And I'll just add to that, I think it sort of has a trickle down effect in the sense that, or in some ways, actually, maybe the opposite, like it's building upon a foundation, right? So I think that by making academic achievement important, and by marking it as something important enough to have a graduation requirement attached to it, it has this effect where other disciplines, so even like history is not necessarily an MCAS subject, but we have a common assessment. We do data rounds between colleagues on how are we doing, and are we hitting these particular standards, and are these particular students hitting those particular standards the right way? we've been able to realize the last 2 years that we're probably not doing the best by our EL students in the history department. So we're getting support from our EL directors and other EL coaches who are coming in and are going to kind of help redesign some of our formatives and summatives to help these students perform better. So there's these other kind of ripple effects that happen because of having this reputation. Life sciences are really eager to get in, really hire Revere kids. All the healthcare companies are trying to hire Revere kids. We have a lot of MGH in here. And I think that is because of the global competitive nature, right? So you're getting both a global student body. I think we have maybe 86 or so countries of origins in this high school. But then they're getting a very high quality American education that they can then use to be globally competitive. I've had a student, my speech and debate team captain last year is at Stanford right now. So there's all these different opportunities that kids are getting that they might not otherwise get. And that's coming from a public urban district in Massachusetts.
Yeah, I want to just sort of build on that. One of the features of ed reform that, from my point of view, has not gotten as much notoriety as it deserves are the voc tech schools in Massachusetts. So Pioneer's done a lot of work on it and worked closely with the folks at MAVA. But back before ed reform, the voc tech schools were always enjoyed a pretty good reputation in terms of preparing kids for careers. But in truth, they had pretty good sized achievement gaps, and they have a significant portion of their student body that are special needs. Those voc tech schools now, and it really is because the architects of ed reform made sure that the voc tech schools had to take MCAS and had to be taught the same standards, that then they began to alternate by week between the sort of academic area and the occupational education. And it turns out if you want to produce really good quality carpenters and electricians and plumbers, they've got to know how to read well. They've got to know how to write well. They've got to, if they want to own a business someday, they're going to have to write a business plan and be able to have good sort of oral communication skills, as well as basic mathematics. And so, I want to sort of remind people that one of these big success stories, that it's in a way helped us compete globally, but it's also provided a lot of well-prepared students in the voc tech area, because it matters enormously. And the voc tech people will tell you, many of them will tell you that it was the commitment to MCAS and the academic standards that really helped them bring their game up a lot. But James's point is also an excellent one. As someone who loves history, the fact is we don't know. We don't have any slightest idea, unlike English language arts and science, because there isn't a U.S. history MCAS or any civics MCAS test. We don't know what the achievement gaps look like. We have no idea. And it's one of those areas where you get to see what it looks like when you have English and math and science testing, but you don't for anything for history and civics. So there's just no way of determining where the achievement gaps are, what are the districts or schools that are doing a good job, what can we emulate, where are the best practices. These are all the sort of connective tissue with MCAS that have not only held the system kind of more accountable, but it's also really boosted student achievement and made it sort of a fairer Commonwealth too. So James, for you, again, we've talked a lot about this across the board improvements. The E.D. Hirsch's comment about the achievement gaps were beginning to narrow because of the commitment to MCAS. But talk about MCAS as an equalizing opportunity, as an equalizing standard, rather than having it was when I first started doing this work decades ago, where there was essentially no state standard. There was no state test, and every district, 351 cities and towns, more or less did whatever they wanted. Could you just talk about how the MCAS is a mechanism to actually deliver equality?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think in many ways, as you just alluded to, it's a way to level the playing field in terms of making sure that every single student in the Commonwealth is responsible for learning every standard that everyone else is learning in the state. And it also puts every teacher and district on the same level of we're going to hold each other accountable to these standards. And I think by doing it that way, it sort of removes some of that stigma Meredith talked about earlier, where there's so-called good districts and so-called bad districts. We're able to, I think for a long time, one of our superintendents called Revere a Buddha, or best urban district in America, because they're able to use the test data to prove that, hey, we're actually punching above our weight. So we may not spend the most, and we may not have the richest kids, but we're able to send many of them off to Harvard and Stanford and MIT. We're able to send a lot of them off to rewarding careers, and even students who are going into other professions. We send a lot of students into the healthcare profession, and you really, my wife's a nurse. You really need to know your math and science to be a nurse and to be involved in any kind of level of healthcare. So the fact that we are testing biology is huge when it comes to the life sciences in this, which are just such a huge part of the region in terms of the economy. So I think by giving equal opportunity to these students, right, you're making sure that the feeder schools are not just your Boston Latins and even Cambridge, where I grew up, or the Wellesleys of the world, but it's all of the districts, right, including the gateway cities like Revere, Chelsea, Lowell, Lawrence, and being able to have these standards, we're able to say, hey, we believe every student can achieve these standards as well. So that's just a huge message saying that, kind of going back to what you talked about with the Brown v. Board example, that we aren't assuming students can't learn. We're actually assuming every student can learn if they're taught and put into a proper school setting where they can achieve their highest potential. And I think that's a message that has lots of ripple effects. And I think if we were to go back to the way it was, you would have every district sort of set their own standards. And some districts sure might have higher standards than the standards that are currently on MCAS, but a lot of districts might not. And you might start seeing that disinvestment again. And you might start seeing parents of means pull their students out of public schools. And then the public schools become kind of the place of last resort. So we don't want to go back to that model. I think it's really important that every student in Massachusetts has an equal opportunity to succeed. And MCAS doesn't guarantee equal outcomes, but what it does guarantee is in some ways having that equal opportunity, that everybody's at least learning the same thing. We're testing them on whether or not they've learned it, and then we can kind of figure out where the gaps are and fill in those gaps. And I think the recent funding changes that have happened that have equalized between suburban and urban districts, having the progressive income tax devote some extra money to schools, that extra funding is going to be really important to closing those gaps. But we also need the test to see whether the money is actually being spent wisely and it's being spent in a way that's actually leading to greater student achievement. So I think the test serves two purposes. It helps us identify what places need additional support, but also, make sure that those places are getting the additional support that they need to then produce the results. And I think that's the equalizing effect that it has.
Meredith, you want to comment on that at all or add to that?
I agree with really everything that James just said. I think one of the things that we're hearing from our, I hate to say opponents, because we all want is students to be learning and growing in this state. But folks who are trying to, undo the MCAS as a graduation requirement, is that it's, racially or culturally biased and has racist origins. And really what I would say to that is it's really racist to assume that Black and brown children can't rise to the level of competency to pass these assessments. And MCAS is tied to grade level curriculum and assesses a student's subject matter knowledge, as James pointed out, not innate intelligence. And these results on these types of assessments does help us to give the resources that we need into these spaces and places that it really needs to go. So that is something that frustrates me, is when people say that it's not helping the most marginalized, because I really think that MCAS is a driving factor for that.
Yeah, and I think, and it's interesting. The METCO program is a desegregation era program from the mid 1960s. It's one of the largest and best of its kind in the country. Elizabeth Setrange, a very well-respected MIT educated researcher at Tufts University, just in the last year produced this 6-year longitudinal study that she embarked on METCO. All of it, and all of the ability to evaluate the success of that program, which sends largely African American but minority kids from Boston and Springfield to leafy suburbs. The whole way we know, and that researcher did that research to determine the success of the METCO program, was because of MCAS data. She couldn't do that work. There's no way you could identify the success of a program like that, whose whole purpose is to provide racial equity and equality of educational opportunity. And so that is, I think, another example of how just the basic data, having the knowledge of the data, and then policymakers can expand that program, or they can allocate more funding to it based on the data. But you can't make decisions on things that don't even have the basic familiarity or knowledge or data around. And the MCAS really does help do that. So that's another way in which it really helps deliver the kind of equity that I think people are really aspiring to in public education. Meredith, so you're the leader of DFER Mass, a leader with DFER Massachusetts, and you've put together this sort of diverse coalition of education reformers and advocates to sort of push back on the ballot effort to scrap MCAS, a high stakes test. Could you just talk about the anti-testing drive to undo MCAS as a central part of that reform?
Absolutely, Jamie. And yes, to be clear, I'm not the leader of DFER Mass, but I am a leader within DFER Mass. So yes, we have, assembled a diverse coalition of folks on this, of all across the political spectrum, all across, within the education space. We have the practitioner level, obviously, James, and we have superintendents, we have principals, we have different associations, and then we also have different business groups, different public policy organizations, different education groups. So we really have quite a motley crew all over the Commonwealth of folks who are passionate about this. But, a key here is that the MCAS is not going away. That is true. But the MCAS as we know it would be really severely watered down should something like this pass. If, the 10th grade graduation requirement is taken away, that signals to the entire chain all the way down to 3rd grade that the test is not, as meaningful or important. As a teacher, I think James can attest to this. The first question that your kids ask you when you give them an assessment is, does this count? Or is this being graded? And if a student is asking that question right now in our current terms, from 3rd grade all the way up to when it counts in that 10th grade MCAS, the answer to that is yes. But if the graduation requirement is taken away, the answer to that would really be no, in the sense that it doesn't count for their own, achievement. And then how can we rely on that data if students are not taking it as seriously, or not responding to it in the way that needs to happen? So I think, again, and I will keep reiterating this, the key really here is to focus on MCAS as a tool, and it's a tool that we can use to identify that students are getting what they need. And frankly, Jamie, to your point before of the METCO data, it often frustrates me that MCAS gets scapegoated as sort of the problem, but in reality, it's really just information, and it's what do we do with that existing information, and how do we allocate the right resources? It's not the problem, and it's really not the solution either. It's just the information and the data.
James, do you want to talk a little bit about the sort of the conversations or buzz among teachers? It's I'm a firm believer. I came from a family of educators, mother, grandmother, teachers, and I've always believed that the people on the ground in the classroom that matters most. Could you just talk a little bit about the buzz and the conversations among teachers about the ballot initiative, what people are saying about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's definitely something that is probably going to be close. I think it's a question that a lot of people have divided feelings about, right? And I think teachers are no different from the general public in that regard. I will say the vast majority of my own colleagues who've seen my advocacy on this, who've listened to the podcast and things like that, have said mostly nice things about what I have to say. In terms of the critics, 2 colleagues I deeply respect. One who's retired, one who is still active. They did listen to the podcast. They're kind of not angry with me, but sort of angry with the idea that MCAS is like for them, they feel like MCAS is a floor, is like being treated as a ceiling in some ways, and it should be a floor. And I don't think that necessarily speaks to whether or not MCAS should be maintained or not, but kind of the idea that, if all that we are doing is making sure we're hitting these standards, we should try to go above and beyond what MCAS is asking, right? And I don't think there's anything that precludes a district from doing that. I do have concerns that if we were to remove the requirement, we're much less likely to see that. If anything, we're going to see people sort of revert back to having 351 different standards across districts. So I think there's a lot of teacher concern about this, both because I'm an MTA member. It is something that the MTA has the big sponsor behind this. It wasn't really something that we were sort of given an up or down Democratic vote about. It's something that the leadership at the convention and the self-selected group of people who go to that decided to pursue. Most of my colleagues have been very supportive of my particular efforts here, and would probably echo what I say. And there's just a deep concern that there's other things that have happened that are not MCAS related per se, but the pandemic, learning loss, the laxity in attendance, the laxity in behaviors, the change to suspension law. So there's been a lot of changes we've had to sort of go through the last 7 years. And there's a concern that this would be one more sort of maybe idealistic, nice change on paper that would have sort of real world consequences for our kids. I think a lot of the ads and the commentary, including the response from that I just read on Commonwealth from my own union president, it's about, oh, we feel bad for these kids that can't pass. And I feel bad for them too. And I feel bad that we let them down, right? I think just socially promoting them is not a way to go around this issue. And I'm deeply concerned that if we were to have the graduation requirement go away, it is, as Meredith said, a lot of people would not take it seriously anymore. It would be something kind of like the PSATs, where kids necessarily don't treat it as a real test. They don't behave the same way. Teachers don't treat it the same way. So kids still take it, but it's sort of like, oh, you might get a scholarship out of this. There's a carrot, but without that stick, whether it's going to require your admissions or going to help you with graduating, they're not going to take it as seriously. And I do worry that the data would get skewed in that way, that people wouldn't take it seriously anymore. And I've seen kids who've not passed, who've been pushed to pass, who feel good after passing. My own nephew has some special education needs, and the fact it took him, I think, 6 or 7 times to try, and he finally passed when he was 20. He was proud of that achievement, right? And he's also someone who's been thankful for this effort on my behalf. So I think that's something that we don't want to remove. It would just be kind of passing these kids along instead of actually doing the work. And they do have the opportunity, if they don't pass, to retake and to try again. And I think that's such a huge part of education, is growing, right? And learning from your past mistakes and being able to make changes so that you can pass going forward. So I do think that having it as a graduation requirement forces us to do that work. And it forces us to do, in some cases, is very difficult work of making sure that the kids in front of us are able to be successful coming out of here.
Yeah, I want to echo that. Remember Tom Birmingham in Chelsea's, and I remember ed reform with no test. There was a state test. There's the MEP test. And I remember Tom Birmingham telling a story about how he asked students whether they took the MEP test seriously, and they said no, we don't take it seriously because there were no stakes connected to it. So they basically dedicated the amount of effort to the test that the test warranted, because there was no consequence for it. And I think that people forget really that the reason why they did the ed reform law, the reason why all the architects of ed reform were unanimous in their view that what we have with MCAS looked exactly like the assessment that they had in mind in 1993, is that there was a very real concern that there were kids that were graduating who could not read their diploma. And it wasn't just anecdotal. I worked in Chelsea. That was a reality. And so, I think part of what we need to do is that, and maybe Meredith can talk a little bit about, is a lot of sort of false claims, or there's a lot of discussion about the pass rates. But, Meredith, maybe you could talk a little bit about what the pass rates are for MCAS. As well as, the fact is that for many, many years, the state allocated about $30 million for MCAS remediation. That money has gone away gradually, which I think is a mistake, because they want to make sure that kids, if you set a standard, that there's a reasonable chance that kids can pass it. But Meredith, maybe you could talk a little bit about the pass rates and the number of students that we're talking about that aren't passing.
Yeah, thank you for this question. This is one of my, favorite myth-busting exercises is, as James said, really, we are so focused on the floor. We're not really focused on the ceiling. And it's incredibly frustrating that we have to fight for the floor on this. But I believe it's something like 80% of students pass the very first time that they take this test, but eventually something like 98% eventually get there there's a couple of different pathways, right? So something that we're hearing a lot from our opponents on this issue is it's a high stakes one-time test that, one time students are sitting for this test and that determines their future. That is simply false. Students have multiple attempts at the MCAS. If you're, taking the English and math, I think it's 4 tries. For science, I believe it's 5 based on the 9th versus 10th grade when they start taking those tests. That's multiple attempts to take the same test. And many students end up passing by the time that they take those tests. There's also different pathways if you do not. So there's an appeals process, which in 2019, I believe 70% of appeals were granted, which sometimes I'm talking to folks and they say, I wish that I could do some sort of portfolio for my student who didn't pass the MCAS. And I'm like, well, you could do an appeal, which takes into account, attendance and coursework and teacher recommendations. And certainly it's a little bit more work for an administrator or a teacher to gather that kind of information. But that package of student achievement is sent over to DESE, and then they make a decision about whether or not the student is ready to graduate. And as I said, 70% of those appeals are granted. So there's that pathway. And then there's also the education proficiency plan, which if a student just barely misses the cut score, gets a certain in range, essentially those students are put on sort of a separate track where they're given remediation. They don't necessarily, I believe, have to take the MCAS again, but they do have to check in with their guidance counselor and make sure that they're taking certain courses and meet certain achievement levels. And really those structures are in place to make sure that, as James was describing, the students that we are technically, feeling bad for who didn't graduate are getting that wraparound support and getting that extra energy. And at the end of the day, one student not graduating is too many, but really it's just 1% of students in the Commonwealth. I believe 700 out of 70,000 graduates who don't end up meeting this graduation requirement. And so that slim number is really where we need to be putting our effort and our attention. And if something like this were to go away, we wouldn't know who those students were. They would still exist. They would still be behind, as you're describing. They would not be able to read their diploma, but we wouldn't know who they are, and we wouldn't know where to allocate our resources.
James, maybe you could talk a little bit about MCAS as an instructional tool in the classroom. I mean, one of the things I remember from not that long ago down in Cape Cod in Barnstable, the district actually hired a woman who was a data specialist who used to break down the specific questions, where the district or the school or the class were failing or not up to par on. You just talk about that, about the use of MCAS data or the use of the test at the school or the classroom level, the discussions between the faculty and the administration or the principals about it as a kind of diagnostic tool or as an instructional tool.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think, I also happen to have taken my administrative's, I haven't got my administrator's license yet, but I took the administrator's course. It's called the CAGS program. And I took a whole, graduate level course on how to interpret this data. And it's something that is a requirement for every administrator in this state, at least, to have taken that course and to be familiar with data. It's one of the 4 elements you have to hit in order to get the license to be an administrator. So it's certainly something that I have experience with. And I think at the director level, we have a humanities director who handles both English and social studies, and there's an equivalent STEM director who does science and math. Other districts have different directors in different departments, but it's certainly something that, I'm very comfortable talking about data, very comfortable talking about it amongst teachers. I think in 2 weeks, I'm going to be leading a group doing that, looking at our own internal history department assessment. So it's not looking at MCAS data, but it's looking at, kind of a range of which students did well on this summative, which students did kind of in the middle, and which students did really well, and which students haven't, met the standards yet. And that's just doing our own history standards internally. So I think it's something that informs our practice, and having data informed practices is just an essential part, both in the teacher rubric in terms of evaluations, in terms of the administrative rubric, and the district level data. I think is used particularly by superintendents, but also by high school principals to kind of drive conversations. And if they can see that, hey, 9th grade bio, we're not really doing good by our ELs, our English language learners, what can we do to improve that for next year, right? I think those conversations certainly happen a lot at the math and ELA levels as well. And it's something that, even though we don't have an MCAS and history, we've kind of adopted, and I think it's kind of the ripple effect of the ed reform, right? Like, I think we've adopted a lot of the same kind of diagnostic tools that these other departments use. And in terms of our own changing to the standards, I mean, we were always told there will be a history MCAS at some point. So we're ready to go if there is one, in the sense that we've already, as a department, have gotten very acclimated to using common assessments, figuring out, even by the question, which, who's doing well on what question, and also going through the demographic sub-data to figure that out as well, and how we can make improvements and adjustments to our practice to be better. So I think it's just something that's endemic to education now. And I think there used to be an allergy to data, and it's just something that's kind of infused at all levels of the practice, both at the teacher level and also at the administrator level, that we want to make sure that we're making progress by our students.
Absolutely. So Meredith, one of the things I've been really struck by in the 30 plus years that I've been working around education reform in Massachusetts is how the political leadership in Beacon Hill has, generally speaking, held firm to this grand bargain of the money in exchange for accountability and high standards and testing for everyone in the system. And so that's true today too. I mean, the reality is, with the governor and the legislative leadership, as it was in 1993, has held firm to this and is in support of it. Could you talk about this sort of extra legislative effort to put something that is so demonstrably successful over decades on the ballot, and taking it out of the hands of the lawmakers who pay for and allocate the funding for K-12 education? Could you just talk about that? Why this strategy of going around the democratically elected officials to make this kind of bold change in something that's been so successful?
Jamie, how much time do you have? I could talk about this for an entire webinar, but it's a good question. And I think, first and foremost, for those of you outside Massachusetts, for those of you who are planning to vote in Massachusetts, you probably received there was a red booklet sent out to voters with all of the different ballot questions that are up. I urge you to take a look into that. The legislature did do a report on each one and where they stand on it. There are a lot of ballot questions this year. And I think, we are number one in education in Massachusetts, but something that we're not so good at is passing legislation through our legislature, for better or worse. Obviously, there's some positive to that. It means there's a lot more consensus building when bills do end up getting passed. A lot of times they go through different vehicles and really have to go through a bunch of different processes over multiple sessions in order to become established policy. There are some drawbacks of just, the length of time that it takes. And so I think, honestly, there are advocates who've been pushing for this legislatively for a long time. And as you're describing, Jamie, legislators said no. They looked at the data, they looked at the research that we do have on our side, and they said, this doesn't make sense. And so folks are going around that process where, the governor, Senate President Spilka, House Leader Mariano, all these different folks have said, we do not agree with this. And folks are going around this process, collecting signatures, trying to put it on the ballot, or it now exists on the ballot, and going in that route, in that direction, because they couldn't get it done legislatively. From my perspective, going through this process, ballot questions are a really interesting way to make policy. Frankly, they're really expensive ventures. And when I think about the amount of money being spent, the Massachusetts Teacher Association is spending a lot of money. The motley crew of coalition members that we've built are spending a lot of philanthropic dollars on this. When I think about the millions of dollars being spent on this issue that could be spent to make sure that our kids are learning how to read and getting the resources that they need, it is really mind-boggling. And so I think when you look at the fact that most of the statewide leaders, the Secretary of Education, the Lieutenant Governor, the Governor, is all on our team and on our side on this, and leaders of the state legislature as well, that who have dug into the data and who have been spending years and years on this issue, really agree. And so, yeah, it is a very frustrating way of making policy, and I hope that it doesn't continue in this way.
Yeah, I agree with that. I remember 93. I remember, Tom Birmingham, Mark Roosevelt, Bill Weld. There was a lot of give and take and compromise that crafted it. Some states did just standards or testing or more money or whatever. Massachusetts did it all. It really did the most comprehensive education reform effort that this country has seen in 50 years or so, and it did it all. And it's a very intricate political and policy compromise, really, that the money in exchange for, it's not only good politics, but it's good policy, really. And so you had a guy like Bill Weld, who's represented the suburbs largely. I mean, that was a major constituency for him, and he knew that the progressive funding was not going to benefit the leafy suburbs, and he was for it. And because he understood that there was a basic fairness with that, whereas some of the toughest critics of standardized testing were in urban districts, and Mark Roosevelt and Tom Birmingham represented those districts, and they really bucked the special interest to do this and put this grand bargain together. And so, I think it's, that's the Hippocratic Oath is, first do no harm. And I think that's the thing that's really amazing to me is that there'd be this effort to harm something that has made us the envy of the country and made us internationally competitive. So maybe you both could talk a little bit about, we hear a lot of these false claims about how it cuts into instructional time. I mean, I can give you a lot of stories. My nephew went to school in Cape Cod public school system. He read Moby Dick, he read Dante, he read all these wonderful pieces of like timeless literature. Now, he ultimately went on to study engineering at WPI in Worcester, but he had all this grounding in this classic literature, and he allowed him to do well on things like the SAT and ACT and these standardized tests. Could you just talk a little bit about some of those discussions about the teaching to the test and instructional time being sort of damaged by having MCAS?
Sure. I can kick us off, and then I obviously want to hear from James on this. This is something that we hear a lot, is that students or teachers are teaching to a test. What I would urge folks to do is sort of, if you replace test with standards, that teachers are teaching to the standards, that's not a problem. And teachers should be teaching to the standards. And the test is really an assessment, a checkpoint to say, okay, teachers are teaching to the standards, as you're describing, Jamie, that it is rich, it is important, it is great knowledge. And to the amount of instruction time point, according to DESE, I believe it's statewide testing accounts for only 1% of class time each year. So it's really not as much as folks are saying. Obviously it's a district level decision of how much time to devote to test preparation particularly. But at the end of the day, the test is really testing the standards. And if the standards are being taught, then the test should be a no-brainer.
Yeah, and I can add to that. In terms of test administration, it might be 6 days, and they're not even full days. Usually we'll see our regular students the last period of the day. So it's usually just that 8 to 12 period. And typically on those days, they actually have students who are not taking the test will go to enrichment opportunities. I know in our case, like since the sophomores are taking the test, the juniors will go on college visits. The seniors usually will have sort of their spirit day kind of things going on, and then the freshmen would just have a regular day. So it really depends on. It's not the entire school taking a test for 5 days straight. It's really a different beast than that. And certainly, a lot of legwork to administrate it. I know that we've recently hired someone to kind of help us with that, to take it off the plate of the guidance counselor director who was a little overworked by it. But it's something that's not, a huge burden on the school. And in terms of test prep, I mean, it's really, we're teaching you the standards, right? So like, I joke that like every teacher teaches to the test because we give tests. We give tests in our own subject. Otherwise, we wouldn't know whether our kids were learning or not. And essentially, the MCAS is just kind of a universal version of that at a macro level. That's the same thing that we're giving on a weekly or biweekly or monthly basis at the micro level, right? And in some cases, I would say it's what we're giving is probably more difficult than what the MCAS is asking, at least in terms of the ELA and that I'm experienced with. The senior level ELA class is going to be a lot more difficult than what's being asked at the sophomore level MCAS. In terms of history, I mean, we're assuming that the kids already know how to do the argumentative essay because they've already taken and passed, the ELA 10 MCAS. So we're asking that more of them in some cases by the time they get to junior and senior year. There's just kind of a built-in assumption that they know how to do certain things because they've already learned it as sophomores. So that's kind of my understanding of it. I don't, in the sense that there may be some instructional time spent on MCAS questions, they're geared towards the standards. So if people are worried about well, we're teaching something that we're not teaching the things that aren't on MCAS. Well, the things that aren't on MCAS are the things that the state doesn't require us to teach. And there's methods of making sure that the state puts those onto the standards. So DESE's always, I think, open to having teacher and parent input on what should be taught. And if anything, in the history example that I'm most familiar with, we've increased what we're teaching, both in terms of the scope, to include more global lens, to include more diverse perspectives, but also in terms of the skills that we're assessing. So it's not just can you answer 100-point multiple choice question, 100-point question on a multiple choice test, but can you actually do argumentative essays? Can you present things, an oral component? Can you analyze text, not just your point of view, but can you also interpret it on your own and lend your own lens to it? Having the human rights requirement. So that we've added things over the years. So it's not just teaching to kind of a minimal what's on the test, but it's actually teaching to a broader set of standards that the Commonwealth actually can continually shape, and citizens can have input on it. So I actually think it's an interesting example of democratic accountability in a way, that parents and community members and students have seats on the Board of Education. I used to be on that. They have input in terms of what goes on what goes in these standards and what ultimately would go on the test. It's not just some generic Pearson test that's made in some other state. It's very uniquely set to what the math standards are, which we all contribute to as citizens.
Yeah, I want to echo that too. I mean, I think it's hard for people to fully appreciate, and I've got some longevity on it, but what Massachusetts did is really tailored for Massachusetts. The MTEL test for teachers, which is aligned with the MCAS and the MCAS standards on academic content, the MCAS test itself, the state standard, these were all developed locally. They were developed by teachers and policymakers here in the Commonwealth. And one of the unique features about MCAS going back decades is that they release the test questions. They release a lot of the test questions, and they do that to keep it fresh and to replenish the test so it's not stale. They do it at some expense, by the way, but that it also then turns those questions back to educators and to folks to scrutinize and to also identify where they've got some weaknesses. So we've got just 2 or 3 minutes left. So and I've got a handful of questions here left to go, but I'm going to just focus on one of them, and I'd like both of you to go to almost kind of a speed round question. So, could you both of you talk about it from your different perspectives? You've got, for someone who's both taught and worked in policy, someone who's a teacher, just talk about what you think it's going to look like and what are the long-term implications for students in their college and career preparation without MCAS as a high-stakes test.
I can jump in just saying, I think we'll go back to the days of having different standards from different districts, and some districts might prioritize certain things and other districts might not prioritize those things. So it'll go back to a world where your zip code really determines your destiny a lot more than the current status quo that we're living in. Obviously, I think MCAS, if anything, has shown us that we do have a lot more work to do in terms of closing these equity gaps. But without that knowledge of where they are, I don't think we're going to make a ton of progress on closing them. And I think we're going to go back to a day where we just assume that students from working class communities and minority majority communities like the one I teach in are not capable of doing this work. And I really think that'd be tragic.
Yeah, I completely agree with James. And I think one other piece on this is there's a lot of conversation right now, should this pass, what would happen? There's conversation around Mass Core being required, which is, the state's recommended course taking requirements for students in, public schools in Massachusetts. The issue, with Mass Core is it's a great recommendation of robust, course taking, but there's no real way to track rigor. And so, again, I'm plugging the Voices for Academic Equity. They released a report earlier this year on Mass Core and demonstrating that it's the self-reported data from an urban school district where I believe 95 or 100% of ninth graders were passing Mass Core, but only maybe in the 20% percentile for meets or exceeds on their MCAS, versus another district where, in self-reported data, 70% of students are meeting Mass Core, but then, maybe 50 and 60% are in the meets to exceeds range for MCAS. And so we would really go back to a place of that sort of subjective, self-reported data where you're not really able to demonstrate the rigor and understand what is really happening with student outcomes. And that, as James described, really scares me, especially as the 351 plus different local requirements for schools. So.
Thank you. So both of you really are grateful for your work, your comments, your insights today. Yeah, to summarize, and again, I have some perspective here. I've worked on education policy for 30 years. And the folks who drove this, the architects of ed reform, are really trying to make the Commonwealth a fairer, more equitable place. They believe firmly that in a democratic society, kids from all backgrounds should be able to rise according to their talents. And the test and the standards and the progressive funding formula, this has been enormously successful for making the Commonwealth a fairer, more equitable place, as well as making it a Commonwealth that is able to compete and in the global economy. So Pioneer is really pleased to be able to host this webinar. We're really pleased that DFER and Meredith and James have taken the time. Grateful for the audience participation. We've had several papers around NAEP and TIMS and SAT that we've produced in the last 6 or 8 months, and of course a lot of work going back years that Pioneer has done in support of ed reform. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew Horgan from Pioneer to kind of give you some closing comments about what's coming next from Pioneer.
Thanks, Jamie. Really appreciate it. Hi, everyone. My name's Andrew Horgan, and I'm the Chief Development Officer here at Pioneer. Thank you so much for joining us for our webinar, MCAS at a Crossroads. I want to take a moment just to first and foremost say thank you to Jamie and Meredith and James, for just leading this conversation, which is so important. As the father of 3 school-age kids, certainly something that I'm keeping an eye on. So thank you for all your efforts there. What I did want to do is I wanted to be sure to share with you some events that are going to be coming up in the next couple of weeks. So what I will do is I will go ahead and pull this up for you to see. So as you can see here, we have 3 events that are coming up. Tomorrow is our first, which will be with our Law Center. We'll be hosting a webinar on the end of home equity theft in Massachusetts. A really great initiative that the Law Center took on and was successfully able to help protect individuals' equity in their homes. So please be sure to turn into that tomorrow at 10 a.m. Next, on Thursday, October 17th, the Law Center will be hosting its first inaugural Brackett Denison Rule of Law lecture. It's going to be a fascinating conversation on free speech on college campuses. Paul Clement, the 43rd Solicitor General, will be giving our talk that night. And if you have any interest in learning more about that, please do reach out to the Pioneer team here. And finally, on Thursday, November 7th at 6 p.m., we will be hosting our 2024 annual dinner and Peters lecture, featuring Roland Fryer, who's an economist at Harvard, who will be giving a talk on the importance of capitalism and its ability to drive social mobility. So a lot of great things coming up. Hope that you will be able to join us again in the future. And thank you all for joining us today for what will continue to be an important conversation in the coming weeks. Thanks so much, and hope you have a great day.